And people with diabetes have problems with that. So normally when you eat food and you get blood sugar going into your bloodstream from your gut, normally you would release insulin, and that would tell your body to start sequestering sugar away and storing it away from your bloodstream, and that would bring the level of sugar back down. And it's just one of the ways that your body is constantly managing your internal environment. So you mustn't be too hot or too cold, you mustn't have too much or too little salt, and sugar is another one, just to keep all the cells in an environment in which they're happy. So people with diabetes have trouble with this. So obviously, if they don't have enough sugar, it's a problem because their other parts of their body will need that for energy. But they also have a problem if they have too much sugar in their bloodstream. And I've cut and pasted something just from the NHS website. This is from the UK Health Service. And it explains symptoms of high blood sugar. So they usually come on gradually. They may only start when the blood sugar levels are very high. And symptoms include feeling thirsty, peeing a lot, feeling weak or tired, blurred vision, and losing weight. So it's pretty unpleasant for anyone who has to deal with this. But yeah, high blood sugar, hyperglycemia, really not a nice thing there. And kind of just as bad as hypoglycemia. You need your blood sugar to be within kind of certain levels. So I said it was positive information. I didn't say it was happy information. I'm just trying to tell you things that I think won't raise any conflict. I don't think there's anything controversial here. It's probably likely you either know it before or you're quite happy to accept what I'm telling you. Step 2 is to acknowledge the misconception. And this stage is interesting. It says acknowledge because you don't want to bang on about it too much. Some people get very worried about this, that if they talk about the misconception, then it might stick it in people's minds, and you might end up, even though you're trying to debunk it, you might end up actually making it stronger. And recent research shows that's probably not going to happen. So you probably don't have to worry about that backfire effect, as they call it. But there are a few things you can do that will help. Just be a bit careful that you're not over making them think about the misconception itself. So I've got a few ideas here. And one is something I used to do actually in the Dome, which is when I asked children, I wanted to ask about their misconceptions about the phases of the moon. But instead of saying, who can tell me why the moon changes shape? What I would do is say, what have you heard? And what this meant was they could tell me the misconception, but they didn't have to publicly say that they believed it. Because especially publicly, if they make a personal connection to that belief, it's going to be harder to give up. Anything with kind of personal connections is going to be more sticky in the brain. So in this way, they could tell me it, but they never had to tell me if they believed it themselves. And the other thing was to make it clear that misconceptions are really common, that lots of people have all these different ideas, isn't it interesting? And I said that with the thought in mind that if their teacher had told them the misconception, I didn't want to make their teacher sound really stupid, or if their mum had told them the misconception, I didn't want them to have to accept their mother wasn't always right. So and this is something that's generally useful if you can kind of encourage people to be quite skeptical or a little bit skeptical, then it generally helps with all sorts of misconceptions. And the last one, this is the most important one. This is one that came out of a 2017 meta-analysis on debunking. There was one thing they found that would reinforce the misconception for sure. So do not do this. Do not allow learners to generate arguments supporting the misconception. So that, it turns out, is really bad. If you do that, they're likely to come out of your debunking session with even stronger beliefs in the misconception. But generally, just don't let them think about it too much. You want to activate it. You want to kind of dust it off from the long-term memory, bring it into the working memory, remind them that they have this belief. But you don't want to really get them to think about it too much and give it too much exercise. So how does it feel to have a misconception? Well, this is where I'm going to tell you what the misconception is. You'll find out why I was talking about diabetes. And this is quite dangerous. It might be quite good this is being done remotely. I tried this on a friend of mine and they actually got quite grumpy with me. So if you have this misconception, you may now feel very angry with me in the next few moments. But if you do, that's actually good. So what I'd like you to do is to kind of be aware of what your brain is doing and observe how your brain reacts to it. This won't work for everyone because not everyone will have the misconception. But if you do, that's kind of a good thing, even if you decide you really don't like me anymore. So I'm going to state the misconceptions. I'm going to put it on screen. This is something that is not true, okay? So it is not true, dare I do this, that sugar makes children hyperactive. That is a misconception, that sugar makes children hyperactive. So I wonder how people are feeling. I'm kind of hoping at least some of you are kind of feeling a bit like this at the moment. It's an interesting one. Lots of people will be thinking of their own kids, their own experiences, and thinking, well, I know that sugar makes them hyper because I've seen it happen. This is ridiculous. Of course, it has to be true. It's actually a misconception. It's very interesting. I'm going to kind of explain why as we go through the 5-step plan. But if you're feeling that like annoyed and kind of at the moment, then that's what your learners are feeling when you're trying to debunk these things. So next step is to refute the misconception. It's really important to do things in this order. So what we're going to do is try to explain to them why the misconception can't be right, why it's wrong. And of course, their brain is going to be doing everything it can to try to avoid listening to you because your brain loves the misconception. It's used it in the past. It thinks it's a wonderful thing, and it will try to protect it from your words. So you need to somehow dance the dance that comes around this. Like, okay, you can make sure they don't ignore you. You can make sure that they're actively responding to you and you have an interactive kind of session where they can't just phase out completely. But I'll give you a few tips for ways that you can do this. So I have put it, so here is our valiant science communicator taking on the great beast of the misconception as envisaged by the DALL-E artificial intelligence image generator. And what I would advise her to do is firstly to aim for the gaps in its armor. So what I mean by that is that you're going for the errors. You're looking for the factual errors, the logical errors. You're very much focusing on hitting those weak points. Secondly, attack one target at a time. The whole thing is too big to take on all at once. So what you need to do is to deconstruct it into smaller concepts. And those smaller concepts then won't be hopefully quite so dearly held and also will be easier to attack in a very precise, aimed way. So, and also it doesn't take as much thinking to deal with it. So break it into little things, take out little bits one at a time until you've weakened the whole thing. Also avoid unnecessary conflict. So you're going to be causing cognitive conflict. It's not pleasant, no one likes it. So don't do that more than necessary, use it wisely. So for instance, earlier on I was saying about asking children what they'd heard rather than what they believed. And that's an example of that, but I don't want them to have to deal with the conflict of, I thought I was clever and I just said it in front of my friends, therefore it can't not be true. You want to really focus your use of cognitive conflict down and try to swerve around other potential instances. And finally, use their own weapons. So your learners arrive obviously with mind full of ideas and prior knowledge and memories. And it's much easier to process information using prior knowledge, which you already know really well. So for instance, if you were talking about the phases of the moon, it may well be that you have kids who have the misconception about the Earth's shadow causing the phases of the moon, but the same child may well also know that eclipses are very rare and special events, but perhaps they've just never had those two bits of knowledge together into their working memory at the same time. So they've never been able to have the opportunity to conflict. But if you can use things that they already know, firstly, it's going to like really freak them out, but also it's easier for them to process. And you want to make it easy to process because things that are easily processed also sound more true. So it's good. If they're happy as well, they're more likely to believe you. So this is really good that you have like psychological reasons that everyone should be happy. You don't want to kind of be mean to them during this. So I'll give you an example. I'm not going to really properly debunk this because I want to talk about misconceptions, not about sugar. But I'll show you how I might structure such a refutation for this misconception here. So for instance, I might start by, I'm going to break it down. So I might go back to the diabetes. This is why I was talking about diabetes, of course, and making the point that if you have lots of sugar in your blood, it actually makes you feel tired, not hyper. And of course, that doesn't bring down the entire misconception. But I think part of the reason this misconception is so believable is because of it seems simple. You think, I eat sugar, sugar goes in my blood, it gives me energy. But that's not how the human body works. It's not. And people did try to work out whether, oh, maybe if you have a burst of insulin, that sets off a burst of adrenaline, maybe. But they checked it out and they can't work it out. And there's really no credible mechanism as to why eating sugar would make you hyperactive. So it's not saying it doesn't disprove it, but it does mean that if it's true, it's something unknown and complicated about our physiology that would cause that. I'm going to pick my battles and make it clear that, yes, parents do observe children getting hyper after sugar. I'm not arguing against that. So if any of you are there shaking your heads going, oh, I've seen it, I'm not arguing against your memories. I'm not saying your memories are false. I'm sure you remember seeing your children getting hyper after having sugar. I don't question that at all. But the interesting thing is when they've done research studies on this, and they've got parents and kids in a room and they've given the kids a sugary drink, and the parents are saying, yes, you can see they've gone hyper now. The interesting thing is the independent observers, they only see the parents' behavior change. They don't know any change in the behavior of the children, but they see the parents get more attentive and they start correcting the child's behavior more. Now, this one got my friend really grumpy with me. And he said, well, of course it has to be wrong because he's immediately marking it must be an error. And he goes, well, I'm their parent. I know them better than anyone. Of course, I can see their behavior. I know them. How can an independent observer judge it at all as well as I can? Which is a completely good argument. Absolutely fine. The really interesting thing is when you do double-blind studies, the effect disappears completely. So if the parents, the children, the researchers, if nobody knows who's had sugar or not, or sweetener even, then no one goes hyper. There's no connection at all. And in studies where they've led the parent to believe that the children have had sugar when they haven't, the parents then do observe it. So what the research shows is that children eating sugar makes adults believe they are hyper, which is really interesting. And it's kind of almost, I think, more interesting than sugar making children hyper. And I think it can be explained quite simply. And I'll be doing that in the next section. I'm going to give you a, I think, fairly straightforward conception that could replace this misconception in your mind. But first, we have come to the first breakout room, and I've been talking a lot already. I've gone through a lot of content. So what I thought is that you could have 15 minutes. And what I want you to do is to refute the misconception about the moon's phases being caused by eclipses. And you could talk about ways that you've done this yourself in the past or ways that you might do it in the future. But kind of if you discuss it, but discuss it in light of what I've been saying and the techniques that I've been talking about. So the 4 techniques I said specifically for refutations were to aim for the gaps in its armor, to attack one target at a time, to avoid unnecessary conflict and use their own weapons. I'm going to write that in plain English so that you can actually remember what I meant by those 4 points. So I'm going to set a stopwatch, I think. What time is it now? Yeah, we're going to have 15 minutes. So we're going to finish at, what's that going to be? It's going to be just past 10 past the hour. I'll tell you when we're like a minute or two from the end. But yeah, if you can just think, how would you structure a refutation? How can you use these things to do that in this case? And I think if we have breakout rooms, I think online, we're going to have one online. And for the guys in the room, I think groups of maybe 4 or so would be good. But depending on where you're sat and who you're with, you can work it out, I'm sure, for yourselves, how you'd like to do that. If you want to move around and make groups with people you know or new people, either is good for me. So I'm going to press go now and shut up, and you've got 15 minutes to talk about that. So hopefully that gave you an opportunity to think about some things that I've been saying about how you probably be doing this yourself anyway. It's the great thing about educational theory. Quite often you just hear explanations for things that you kind of knew instinctively were good anyway. And I'm not going to ask for people to report back, partly because of timing really and the number of people, but also because the really good stuff is what's already happened inside your minds. So reporting back always makes things feel like the fruit is what gets reported back, but really the important thing has already happened. And all of that thinking and talking about it in your brain is of course the thing that has the effect and makes you more likely to be able to make sense and remember all of this. So let's move on. We have refuted the misconception. At this point, people are feeling a little bit wobbly. Their misconception, which they were so sure of, is now taking a bit of damage. They're feeling a bit uncomfortable. They've got all that cognitive conflict. And that means that you now have the opportunity to explain the conception. So everything up to here, all it's been doing is getting them into the right psychological frame of mind that they're kind of ready for you to explain the conception. And this is why you have to do all of these steps. If you just explain the conception at the start, it'll just bounce off their head and they'll reject it straight away. You kind of need to get them kind of thinking about issues with a misconception and be open to hearing it first. And this, I'm not going to really talk about explaining the conception because you all teach things anyway all the time, and it's teaching things, isn't it? So the only thing I will say is allow time for it. It's if you just tell them this is what it's like, this is what happens, it won't stick. So you've got to allow time. And for the whole debunking of kind of proper big misconceptions, it does take time and it just can't be speeded up. You need to kind of commit to it. And what you need to do is to get your new conception in there, not as just like a single sentence that everybody would write the same thing if you ask them, but you need to have this complex concept, which is complex and deep and multifaceted in the way that the misconception was. So this means approaching it from different angles, going over it in different ways, and linking it to prior knowledge that they have, linking it to memories that they have. And you're trying to kind of get it really sticky in their brain. And rather than just the surface features of it, kind of have them construct this deeper understanding, which is going to make it really strong in their mind. So this is always the slide where I forget what comes next. I think this is where I'm going to try to give you a conception, which is going to replace your possible, some of you, misconception that sugar makes children hyper. So here's my challenge to you. Next time you are in a room and there's some kids who have eaten a load of sugar and they are bouncing off the walls, and your brain offers you your misconception that sugar makes children hyper, don't do that. Instead, use this conception. It's not quite as pithy, but child hyperactivity is sometimes correlated with sugar eating. So you can see where I'm going with this. I'm not going to argue that you haven't seen kids bouncing off the walls after eating sugar, but I'm going to suggest that this is a correlation, not a causation. We know from the studies, with the double-blind studies, that children can eat sugar without going hyper. Even children who have been identified as being sugar sensitive, when they don't know they're eating sugar, it doesn't happen. So, but there is a correlation, and I think that's reasonable. So if you think about times that you have maybe commented to someone like, oh, look at the kids, they've eaten so much sugar. Look at them, they're all going crazy. Think about actual events you've been at and occasions you've been at where you've seen children behaving in this way. and kind of take a step back from the child themselves and think about where you were, what was the context where this happened. So for instance, maybe things like at a fairground. So at a fairground, kids might get huge things of cotton candy, chomp their way through it, go on some rides, go and play on some stalls, eat some more cotton candy, get really, really excited, or flashing lights and all of this. Or maybe on Halloween, the kids have got dressed up, they've gone out after dark, they've gone and knocked on strangers' doors, they've been given big sacks of candy, and they've eaten it all, and they've got really excited and don't want to go to bed now. They're all just so hyper. Or maybe like on a club outing where the kids have got together with all their friends, gone somewhere new, all got to wear the same hat apparently, got massive lollipops, eating them. You can just imagine them all, these lollipops running around on the field screaming with each other. Or the most classic one of all would be, of course, a birthday party. So here's a small child who's recently eaten sugar, and for some unknown reason, she's now really, really excited. So you're probably way ahead of me here thinking about this, but there's something that all of these events have in common other than sugar. And that is that they're all out of the ordinary, out of the everyday humdrum. Lots of them have lots of sensory things, flashing lights, unusual lighting, dressing up, lots of unusual things. And also, these are all social situations in which it would be expected that the children would be very excited. So in any of these situations, if you had a child who was just completely calm, people would be looking at that kid wondering if they were okay. So maybe some of these kids might be a bit hyper because of other reasons other than eating sugar. We know it's not sugar because they've done those studies, but there are often other reasons. And every time you see this, you've got your misconception, and seeing the two things correlated reinforces that misconception, which means you're more likely to see it in the future. And in the case of some of the parents, even when it's not real, your brain will falsify reality to make it fit with that strong misconception. And other times, are there times when children eat sugar where they don't go hyper? Do people even notice those times? Are they as memorable? They don't call on the misconception, so it's the misconception it never gets questioned. So that's my challenge to you. Next time you see kids bouncing off the walls after eating sugar, just look around and see if there's anything else other than the sugar that might have been the cause of it. But to be honest, I don't expect for 1 minute I'm going to be able to debunk this in your brain if you believe this, because it's so strong. And I've read like all of these papers about how they've studied it. And the next time I see a small child bouncing off the walls after eating sugar, my brain's going to tell me that's why. So and they're amazingly sticky things, misconceptions. And I certainly don't expect you all to debunk it just during this talk. But anyway, it's something to think about. So step 5, really important, really, really important. This is one that I think often gets dropped by the wayside. So this is to use the conception. And this is really, really important. So what I mean by use the conception is that we want to give them some new information. That information will go in their working memory. And what we want them to do is to retrieve the conception, this is like the right answer, from their long-term memory, hopefully long-term, where we've put it, and then to process the two together. And this time, of course, there won't be a cognitive conflict because they fit together very nicely. And instead, there will be a lovely, happy feeling because there'll be some sort of nice processing that happens, and they will solve a puzzle or work out a question and be very happy that they've used the conception in a useful, good way. And when they do that, their brain will give a little kind of heart point to the conception, and that helps raise its status in the brain, kind of flags it up as being useful. And the reason this is so important is because the misconception is still there. And although you kind of think you damaged it and you think you brought it down with all your pointing out the errors, no, you didn't. All you did was weaken it for just long enough to squeeze the conception into their brain. But the misconception is still there. It's still linked to all that other knowledge and memories and everything. And it's still there. So next time, say a week later after they've seen you, and they get some new information into their working memory, the brain has a choice. is it going to retrieve the conception or the misconception to make sense of this new information? So the way it decides is by status, and it has to decide which of these two is the highest status idea, which one is it going to use? So it asks, right, how interconnected are they with other bits of information? How connected are they with memories, with different people, with my sense of self? Which one's been most useful in the past? Which one have I used most before? And you probably kind of worked out what it's going to pick. It's going to pick the misconception because it's much more embedded in the mind. It's been retrieved many times. They believe it's been useful in the past. And that's the one that's going to pop out into their head. And this can happen for a long time. They can actually track it with brain scans. It's extraordinary. They can see people kind of trying to fight against it. So what you need to do is to boost the status of the conception to do this. You need to get it so it's as interconnected, as linked to memories and all of this as the misconception is. And only then will they be drawing upon that rather than the misconception. And of course, this is really hard because they may have had years and so many different contexts in which the misconception has arisen. And if the misconception is part of normal folk knowledge, they'll come across it again. And when will they come across the conception again? They really need to do this more than once. They do need to do it more than once. So after you finish with it, if you have one session with them, what will happen? Will they come across the conception again in future? Is there anything you can do that will help that happen? Or if you see them again, can you get them to use it again in the future? And if you don't, it's kind of difficult. Of course, it's really hard. But what I'd say is learning is a journey always. And this is true of all learning, not just of busting misconceptions, of getting any ideas in our head. It always involves going over and over again about it, thinking about it, linking it into as many other ideas, using the information. And if you can get them up a few of those steps, then you've done a great thing. It's not necessary always to do everything all in one burst. And in this case, I think it's more than that. We can show them where the steps are, if they're not even aware they exist. If we can kind of use these tricks to squeeze the conception into their mind, which is kind of really the hard bit. And then if they come across it again in future, they're going to be primed to be able to boost its status, which is probably easier than just getting it in there. So I do worry sometimes that reading all of these research articles and things, you do kind of get to the point where you're just like, learning is really, really hard. And you feel slightly kind of dispirited by it. But I wanted to show you this graph. It will be a graph soon, which is going to hopefully persuade you all that this is all wonderful, in fact, and knowing about misconceptions is important. So this is going to be a bar chart. I'm going to put 3 vertical bars on it. And each vertical bar is for a different cohort of teachers. So this is from a study involving 219 experienced teachers who are teaching concepts to children. And the children have a pre-test and they have a post-test as well to see how well they've learned. And they do it once with topics that don't have particular misconceptions, and they do it again with topics, or at the same time really, with topics that do have misconceptions associated with them. So the y-axis will be like how much the kids have progressed, how much better they've done on the post-test. Right, I'll put some data on it, it'll be a bit clearer what's going on. So my first bar, this is going to be for teachers who have relatively low subject knowledge. I mean, they are experienced teachers. It's not like they don't know anything. They're just like in the lower part of that range. So they have less subject knowledge and they don't know much about student misconceptions. And this is how much progress they made on the misconception questions in this research. So the next bar graph will be for teachers who have similarly don't really know about student misconceptions, but they do have really excellent subject knowledge. So will the teachers with excellent subject knowledge be able to do better by their students? And the answer is yes. Although this is a really small effect. And on the topics that were not prone to misconceptions, there was a massive effect here, and subject knowledge was really, really, really important. But with the misconception prone questions, it's just a little increase. And then my third bar graph will be for teachers who both have excellent subject knowledge, but also they know about the student misconceptions. There's misconceptions that the students are likely to hold. And that one is a lot higher. So I know I've been talking about all this detail, you've got to do all these things, but here, just from these teachers, just from them knowing, and it's not that they've been trained in busting misconceptions, it's just literally they're aware of the type of misconceptions that children might have. And it's just extraordinarily important for teaching. So even if you just kind of think a bit more about them, just being a bit more aware of them, that in itself is a really good thing and can make a big advantage. So I hope that was it. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, persuading you that all of this is useful. But what I've just said is really how it's useful in general. But what would be much more useful, much more interesting is how is it useful to your individual practice? And you're all going to have different situations, different contexts, different learners. Some of you might see them just once, others might see them regularly, and they all have different misconceptions, be different people. And you've got different resources. So we're going to have another breakout now. Again, it's going to be 15 minutes. And this is really an opportunity for you to talk about anything that's been in the talk, but particularly to focus on your specific, literally your situation, about whether any of this can be useful to you, and particularly about any way in which it might actually inform your practice. Because the theory of it all, I find it fascinating, really interesting to learn about. But of course, it has no impact on the learners unless there's actually some change at some point down the line. And that's the really hard bit, is making the theory into practical action that works within the context of the dome or the classroom. So I'm going to give you just a few ideas. I mean, talk about anything you want, but just in case you want some ideas to get started, I've got questions about should you be even trying to tackle certain misconceptions, if or when you should do it. Thinking about who does, like what if 90% of your audience has a misconception? What if only 10% did? Would that change what you did? Thinking about all these ways of allowing for the response to cognitive conflict. And also, if there's anything you can do in your context, is there anything you can do that would help people revisit or use those new concepts after you're finished with them? And I've got a lovely picture here. This is what the DALL-E to artificial intelligence thinks that a planetarium show looks like. So I don't know, there's some good stuff here. It's not 100%, but I think I was quite impressed by this one. So I'm going to turn off my camera again. I'll leave this slide up. And you've got 15 minutes from now to talk about that. Okay, so hopefully you got a chance to kind of think about your own practice and whether you're already doing many of these things, whether there are things you might want to tweak or change. And of course, there's a million ways to approach different things, and every context is different. It's just a matter of trying to have some of these kind of weapons or tools from psychological research, just so that we can always try to do the best we can, really. And I just find it fascinating thinking about all of this stuff. So that brings us on to questions and answers in just a moment. Before I do that, I'm just going to bring up this QR code. So I've been talking about various bits of research during my talk. And what I've done is put a page on my website where I've listed loads of these references with links to them all, like ones you can actually, I've only linked things where you can get access for free. And some of them are very accessible, fairly short documents. Some of them are proper, serious psychology research papers. And there are also at the very bottom, I put some about the sugar misconception as well. If you want to go and dig into that research and decide why it's wrong, then you can have a look at that as well. And then at the top of that page, I've also just put a summary of that 5-point plan as well. So if there's any other references that you would like that aren't on there, or anything else you'd like to know about, or if you'd like me to come and run training for your organization, then of course do get in touch. All my details are right there. The I'll just read it out for anyone who can't read that on screen, but the URL is jennysshipway.com/GLPA-2022 dash references. And what I was going to sneakily do, if I can, I might have to stop sharing my screen to do this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen anyway, so you can see me during questions. So get a picture of that quickly if you can. But also what I'm going to do is put it on as a background so that if anyone missed it, you've got a little bit longer that you might be able to see it. So we're going to do questions now. As I said, I'm not a psychologist. I will do my best to answer them. Hopefully what I can do is I can tell you where the limit of my knowledge is and not kind of talk rubbish at you if I don't know the real answer. So we can take questions from the Zoom chat. If you have a question on Zoom, just type it into the chat box. And we can also take questions, I believe, from the room as well. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so folks, so you understand how this is going to work. We have another microphone that is going to Jenny. You won't hear it in the house, but Jenny is hearing you. But then Jenny's going to repeat the question, whether it's coming in from this microphone or from the Zoom chat. Okay, so if you're able to come up, you can come on up towards the front here. If not, raise your hand. We can bring the microphone to you.
Thank you, Jenny, for your question. I enjoyed your sugar comments. I realized I was a victim of it too. It was great to be curious about my own misconception. My question is, I teach pre-education majors, so people who are going to become teachers, they have plenty of misconceptions. However, you showed us that teachers need to know misconceptions to be successful. So how can we talk about misconceptions without reinforcing them for them? Hopefully.
So when you said, so let me just quickly repeat the question. So the question was about training teachers where the teachers themselves have misconceptions. So if you want to train them to understand students' misconceptions, but the teachers also hold those misconceptions, then how can you do that without reinforcing the misconceptions? I don't know. I think it's I find it quite interesting with this talk, using a talk about misconceptions and kind of trying to debunk a misconception as an example as I worked my way through the talk. And I thought that was quite interesting. And I think psychologically, it's kind of interesting the position it puts the learner into. So I don't know if there's something there. Probably you know better than me, having just been on the receiving end of it. But I don't know. I mean, they do say the backfire effect isn't nearly as bad as they think. So if you read things from 10 years ago, you'll see things saying don't talk about misconceptions at all. But the general feeling now is that it's always worth trying to debunk them, and you're more likely to do good than harm if you do that. So I'd just go for it. Use whatever, inspired skills you have and have a shot at it.
Hi, I'm Sarah from Minnesota, but I have a question about the book Making Sense of Secondary Science. Once upon a time, I found that a helpful resource as a collection of children's ideas and common misconceptions. And the author is Rosalind Driver, but I'm curious if you have any other resources you'd recommend that are maybe more up to date.
Do you mean, can I ask? Do you mean about misconception? Hang on. Do you mean specifically about what astronomy misconception children are likely to hold? Oh, I can't hear you now. You nodded though. Okay, so the question was about, there's a specific book which I haven't heard of, so I need to kind of get you to write that down for me so that I can get it. But whether I could recommend any resources which kind of help overview the types of misconceptions that children hold in astronomy. and what sort of misconceptions they're likely to have. I'm afraid I don't have anything specific. Most of my reading's been more general about the general psychology of misconceptions. And there are some really good papers about specific topics. Like I can dig out for you ones about moon phases and seasons and things. There's some specific resources that do them. But I'm not aware of any that give a really big overview. I know we did a study back in my old dome days where we wrote a really long list of ones that we crowdsourced that we thought might be, and then tested our visitors to find out which were the most prevalent ones of them. But I don't know the answer to that one. I'm very happy to say I don't know. If anyone does know, please tell me. Hello.
Siri. Hi, I guess one thing I'm wondering is, when did this research really take prominence? I think you said even 10 years ago it wasn't prominent. Do you have a time frame for that?
There's a lot of things that have happened certainly in the last 10 years. So there's a 2017 meta-analysis of different studies that was quite influential. So I think anything before around that period, it's definitely moved on. I'm not sure exactly. I mean, the research does go back, but certainly I'm trying to think of the references that I make are probably mostly from 1995 onward. There's one much older one that I reference on my website, but most of them, it's worth looking for stuff definitely since 2016, 2017. Anything before that, I would be very careful in checking whether there are more recent ones. There's one of the references on my website is a 2022 resource that's been written by, I think it's 22 different scholars who deal with debunking. And it's like a workbook kind of overview document. It's like 11 pages of content in it. And that's a really good overview. And because it's so recent and written by academics as well, that's kind of like a really good place to start, I think.
And then one other point is that what this immediately made me think of, if anyone's ever seen the movie Inception, I'm pretty sure every point that you were covering in this, like when you think of the movie and what they do in it, it covers those same points. So if you want to see a Hollywood glossified version, I thought, wow, that's a good movie to take these principles and look at the movie from that angle. I wonder what you think about that. Brilliant.
I've not seen it. I tried to watch it once on the plane and I couldn't hear it. I'm a bit deaf at high frequencies and I couldn't make it out. But now you've made me want to see it. Yeah, the brain is fascinating, the way the brain works, and it's quite different to how you feel it works, but it all makes sense. And I think the more you learn about it, the more sympathetic you are to humans as well. And I think you end up cutting yourself and other people a lot more slack when you understand what's really going on. There was one thing that occurred to me the other day that I read in a document, they were saying about children being stubborn at giving up their misconceptions. And then I heard in a different context, someone saying they were trying to explain something, the person was being really stubborn. So now my new theory I just came up with 2 days ago is that when people use the word stubborn, I'm going to stop and think next time, because I reckon the word stubborn is what we say when someone has a misconception and we can't get past it, and we're giving them all the right information and they're refusing to accept it. And that's probably why. So I'm going to be more sympathetic to stubborn people and try my 5-point plan on them in the future.
Okay, as we wrap this up, let's give a very warm thank you to Dr. Shipway. I don't know if she mentioned, but she's giving up time out of her valuable vacation to join us from Spain today. And I also would like you guys to give a very big thank you to our videography team. I sure threw them a whole bag of curveballs with this one. So, Derek Roll, Carissa Sedor, John Fersch, and behind the column, invisible to me, the Stevenator, Steve Birkland.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so we're in special interest group meetings right now, are all up on the second floor. 2 of them, somebody could volunteer to run because climate change In Encore 1, Sean Latch was not able to join us. Education's in Encore 2. Peggy is here leading that. Technology, Waylena and Steve Birkland are in Encore 3. And VR Planetarium is the person who scheduled that. Also was not able to come to the meeting today, but that's in Salon. And if you've had any experience with VR in the planetarium, take a stroll up there and share what you know. Thank you, and I'll see you at dinner.